Good evening. Welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I am the State Section Director for MUFON LA. I am very pleased and proud to present tonight Scott Littleton, who's going to talk to us about the Battle of Los Angeles. In the early morning hours of February 25th, 1942, a large, mysterious object cruised the skies of Southern California from Santa Monica to Orange County and back again. At about 2 a.m., air raid sirens began to wail, and the night air erupted in a cacophony of thunderclaps as a barrage of anti-aircraft guns opened up on the strange object. Over 1,500 rounds of anti-aircraft shells were fired at the object, but the object seemed impervious, even to the direct hits. The object was never brought down or identified, but a photo of it appeared in the LA Times the next morning. Scott Littleton, Emeritus Professor of Anthropology from Occidental College, was a witness to this object. He was only 8 years at the time. He was living in Hermosa Beach, and I think he lived on the Strand. He's here tonight to talk to us about that event, and he's going to talk to us about, he's researched this topic quite well, and he's going to talk to us about all the interesting facts and findings he's come to. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Scott Littleton. Please give him a warm welcome. This little button here is your forward button. Which one? Okay. This guy right here is forward, and this one, if you get to that's back. There you go.
I've got them set up so they're going straight through.
Great.
Yeah.
Well,
okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Well, before I get started, let me apologize in a way if I'm a little punchy this evening. Like the rest of us, I'm sure almost everybody in this room got an early wake-up call this morning from no, it wasn't extraterrestrial, it was definitely terrestrial. And so there we are. Anyway, so thank heavens it wasn't more serious than it was, but it did sort of jangle my nerves and a lot of other people's nerves as well. Although my wife slept straight through it, so go figure. Okay. Let me begin by stating pretty much unequivocally that I don't by any means consider myself to be a full-fledged ufologist. Until recently, I've never systematically investigated a contemporary UFO sighting or debriefed a possible abductee. However, I've had a lifelong obsession, and that's a good word for it, with the UFO phenomenon. It comes from two sources. One is the fact that I've spent more years than I care to count studying world mythology and folklore, and have long since concluded that our belief systems everywhere have been strongly colored, if not actually engendered, by our perception of and/or interaction with what I've come to call, ringing the changes on the name of the old British colonial establishment in India, the alien Raj. Indeed, I suspect that for the last 10,000 years or so, and perhaps considerably longer, this extraterrestrial colonial establishment, for that is what I think it really is, has exercised its hegemony over humanity in much the same way, fundamentally, that the old British Raj did over pre-1947 India. For the most part, indirectly through native states and rulers, albeit far less obtrusively, at least in modern times. We didn't have Sirdars and build New Delhi, or they didn't, but they're there, I think. Okay, the alien Raj. In 2009, I published a science fiction novel entitled, quote, Phase 2, that explores some of these matters in some depth. Other aspects were discussed in a piece entitled, quote, Divine Rebels, Alien Dissidents, and it's a long subtitle I won't bore you with, that appeared in UFO magazine in 2002, and I'm currently working on a nonfiction book that will probably bear the title, quote, again, Alien Raj. The second and more immediate source of my intense interest in the UFO phenomenon comes from personal experience. In addition to the glowing object that precipitated the so-called Battle of Los Angeles in February of 1942, I've observed 3 other anomalous objects in the skies, and I'd like to share them with you briefly before focusing in on the primary reason you've invited me to speak to your group this evening. In 1937, at age 4, in the Highland Park district of Los Angeles, where I was effectively born and grew up until to age 5, I saw what I later came to think of as a, quote, flying French horn. Although I was supposed to be taking an afternoon nap, it was a bright sunny day. The curtains of my bedroom window were open, and I was definitely wide awake during the 10 seconds or so it took the strange craft to pass slowly and soundlessly across my field of vision. This glowing, gold shimmering object in the mid-afternoon reflecting the sun that looked like a French horn seen head-on, like with all the curves in it. I never mentioned what I'd seen to my parents or to anyone else for that matter until quite recently, and it apparently didn't cause any stir in the neighborhood. And no, I don't think I was abducted, as I have no memory of any missing time, but who knows for sure. Maybe someday I'll have enough guts to undergo hypno-regression, but so far I haven't. More recently, in May of 1990, off the southern tip of Baja California, I watched a bright point of light perform exotic right-angle maneuvers over the ocean for at least a minute or so at approximately 3 a.m. And that time frame will turn up again a little later. 3 a.m. seems to loom large. Before it suddenly disappeared. It was definitely not a plane or a helicopter or the planet Venus on steroids. And in 2003, while driving north on the I-5 freeway north of Lake Elsinore, on a bright summer afternoon, I watched a curious low-level, not very high up, donut-shaped object emerge from behind a hill, move west across the highway at a slow speed, giving out puffs of whatever behind it, and then, like the Baja light, simply vanished. It was only evident for about a few seconds. My wife also glimpsed it fleetingly after I called her attention to it. I should add that a few other motorists appeared to notice the peculiar object, although a couple of cars did slow down appreciably shortly after it disappeared. But the sighting we're primarily concerned with this evening was witnessed by almost 1 million other people in Southern California in the early hours of February 25th, 1942. At that time, less than 3 months after Pearl Harbor, and especially in coastal communities like Hermosa Beach, where we'd moved, my family had moved in the spring of 1941 to a house that faced directly on the ocean. We get it, there it is. That faced directly on the ocean. The threat of invasion was still palpable. And a great many folks, including the military, still expected to be bombed in the near future, that the Imperial fleet was just over the horizon, because we're looking right out over the water. This house, we were right on the beach, and you can see the water is right out here. This is a 1940, the place looked like about a year before the big event, and you can see from the cars here. This is the ocean. So we're looking right out to sea. And so, for that reason, the whole of Santa Monica Bay, from Malibu to Palos Verdes, was soon ringed with anti-aircraft and searchlight batteries belonging to the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade. Get up here. There we are. There is a anti-aircraft in place, a searchlight battery, and I think I have to back up. I must have gone past the searchlight. Let's see, where's the anti-aircraft? There it is. There's the gun. This is a typical anti-aircraft emplacement of that era. Again, they range from Malibu down to Palos Verdes and then over, of course, at Fort MacArthur and elsewhere. And they all came into play that evening. And then this is a, trying to aim this thing right here. Where we go? Come on, there we are. A searchlight, and there were searchlight batteries too. They were all sort of coordinated. The nearest, excuse me, searchlight battery to us was in Manhattan Beach, as I recall, right near the pier. The guns banged away almost every night, shooting at targets that were towed across the sky over the ocean by specially designed planes. The targets would be pinpointed by the searchlight beams, which also illuminated the exploding shells. It was a grand show that usually lasted about half an hour and rarely, if ever, continued after 10 p.m. out of respect for the local population. At first, we kids would watch the action with great fascination, but after a few nights in early January, the noise of the guns and the exploding shells soon became routine, as predictable as the sound of the waves in winter to us beach folks. Most people learned to sleep through the cacophony with few problems. Remember, they didn't practice very late for that reason. Indeed, it gave us a sense of security that our brave anti-aircraft gunners would quickly save us from any attempts by the nasty Japanese to penetrate our airspace. Remember, this is less than 3 months after Pearl Harbor. As I recall, the early evening of February 24th was unremarkable. The anti-aircraft guns fired a few practice rounds and then fell silent well before 10 p.m. I remember going to bed shortly thereafter, reading for a few minutes by the light of a small flashlight I kept hidden under my pillow, and then falling asleep. A few minutes after 3 a.m., here comes 3 a.m. again, I distinctly remember, because I distinctly remember glancing at my bedside clock. I was awakened by the sound of several aircraft passing almost directly overhead. But by the time I got up and looked out my bedroom window, they were nowhere to be seen, although the rapidly fading sound, definitely that made by piston-driven engines. A familiar sound because military planes were overhead quite frequently in the daytime. It seemed the fading sound seemed to indicate that they were heading southeast. It was extremely odd, as we never heard planes at that hour, but we did that night. Puzzled, I went back to bed and had just about dozed off when I was once again rudely awakened, this time by what I initially thought was distant thunder. But as I became fully awake, I realized that the anti-aircraft guns were firing again. Bang, bang, bang. This too was extremely odd, as they never, ever practiced at this hour. Moreover, there was something about the rate and intensity of the bombardment that just didn't seem right, and it was far too loud. Normally, the sound was way off. They were way out over the ocean. But at that point, at 3 o'clock, be about 3:20 or so in the morning, 3:25, it sounded like they were exploding almost overhead, and as it turned out, they were. They were firing right overhead. Then I glanced out my window again, my small bedroom, which was over the front door, I'll point it out shortly, faced south, and thus my view of the ocean was oblique. And I noticed that the sky, what I could see of it, was now filled with blinding searchlight beams and bright flashes. Heretofore, the searchlights and the explosions during anti-aircraft practice, had been well out over the ocean as they fired at drones and were for the most part invisible from my bedroom windows, at least when I was in bed. This time, however, it seemed to be almost overhead, just like the planes had been a few minutes earlier. I heard my parents talking excitedly in the hall, and I poked my head out. My father, who was an air raid warden, looked worried and said it didn't make any sense. He tried to get through by phone to Civil Defense Headquarters, but there was no answer. We later learned that the alert had been called at 2:25 a.m., although nobody had bothered to get the word out to the local air raid wardens in our area. The whole system collapsed, at least in our part of the South Bay. So he put on his gear anyway and ran outside to see what was happening, his helmet and his other bag that he had to carry. He soon returned looking even more grave and told my mother to get me, my paternal grandparents, who lived with us at the time, and my recently widowed maternal grandfather down to the basement bomb shelter we'd begun building in the afternoon of December 7th, 1941, 3 months earlier. Normally, my maternal grandfather was slower than the second coming of Christ in his personal habits, as my mother used to put it. But when my father said, quote, "Mr. Hotchkiss, I think this may be the real thing," he was up and fully dressed in 30 seconds flat. That's one of my memories of that evening. As you can imagine, I was equal parts scared and excited and desperately wanted to know what was going on. By this time, my father was back on the Strand enforcing the blackout that he assumed had to have been ordered. A minute or so later, the local air raid siren finally began to wail. And my mother escorted her in-laws and father down to the shelter, which consisted of what had been 2 small dressing rooms, protected by cartons of sand and stacked in the open basement on either side of these rooms, and which we had gathered from the beach. We had plenty of sand. It was from the beach. We had to get the cartons, right? My father was smart enough to pick up cartons immediately at the local Safeway, because we'd all been watching or listening to, nobody watched anything in those days, Edward R. Murrow, This Is London, and we heard the bombs going off less than a year earlier or so, and we said, well, hey, it's our turn. And so it may seem quaint and kind of amusing, but I assure you it wasn't in March of 1942 in Southern California. Anyway, my mother escorted her family down there, and then I followed along, despite the fact that I was eager to poke my head out and watch the real thing, as my father had put it. My mother felt the same way, as she later said after a couple of minutes in such cramped quarters. The benches upon which we sat also contained survival items such as a first aid kit, water bottles, canned food, and surrounded by the halitosis exuded by the elder generation, she was ready to brave a Japanese bomb or two. When she exited the basement through the door that directly led out to the beach, out to the Strand, let me see if here we are. And the door I'm talking about is right there. That is where we stood, and this picture was taken in about a year earlier, a little less than a year earlier, in 1941, right after we moved there. And although and I followed closely behind her. I mean, she stepped out and I snuck out, 8-year-old, I want to see what's going on, right? So I followed right behind her, and my bedroom window that I told you about where I first saw it was right there. I was looking kind of at an angle. The beach is over this way. I was looking at it out this window and a little bit out this little corner window, and the house looks pretty much the same in that regard today. It's very, very different. The house is still there, by the way, but it's been remodeled a great many times. But nevertheless, I saw it out that window. And so although my mother was, of course, apprehensive about my safety, and at the same time, she understood why I was dying to see what was going on, and she let me stay. It was now about 3:30 a.m., give or take a couple of minutes, in a morning I will never forget. The two of us stood side by side in front of the house, huddling together in the chill night air and staring up at the sky. The planes we'd both heard earlier, she'd heard them, my parents had heard them too, were not in sight, but what captured our rapt attention was a silvery, lozenge-shaped bug, as my mother later described it, that was clearly visible in the searchlight beams that pinpointed it. Although it was a clear, bright night, no other details could be discerned, at least we couldn't, despite the fact that when we first saw it, the object was hanging motionless almost directly overhead. In other words, it appeared when I first stepped out the door and looked up, it seemed to be hovering, which is, in retrospect, fascinating because we didn't have much in 1942, if anything, that could hover like that. So its altitude is hard to estimate, especially after all these years, but I'd guess that it was somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 feet up. This may explain why we didn't see the orange glow reported by several eyewitnesses in Santa Monica and Culver City, where the object was apparently much lower. 12-pound high-explosive anti-aircraft shells were bursting all around the mysterious craft. The noise was almost deafening, and with each bright red flash, the acrid odor of cordite became even more pronounced. Shrapnel was also falling on the beach, and my mother and I backed up against the house to avoid being struck. We saw it coming down. The next day, several of us kids, salvaged boxes of the stuff off the sand and took them to school for the scrap drive, so it got recycled. Oh yeah, well, we were patriotic. However, between shell bursts, between exploding rounds, the craft emitted no sound whatsoever, nor did it seem to be acting aggressively. That's why in the title I displayed earlier, the word attacked in my title is used ironically and is enclosed in quotation marks. If, as we'll shortly see, the object did in fact cause at least one of our planes to crash land, it was probably because the pilot got too close to it rather than any aggressive action on the object's part. In any event, it had clearly come from the north, that is, from the direction of Manhattan Beach, cruising slowly along the edge of the ocean. There. This is a modern view of it, heading north, up. It clearly came from this way, from that direction, although when I first saw it, it was almost directly overhead, or over the water. The beach was about half the width or less then. And so if it was following the edge of the water, it was practically up there. So. As I said, it was apparently hovering almost directly when we first over us, when we first glimpsed it. As we stood there, open-mouthed, watching the remarkable drama unfolding in the night sky, the object, which blithely ignored the intense anti-aircraft barrage directed against it, began to move southward, slowly southward. It was moving at a very stately pace. It was taking its time. Moved southward. Several minutes later, it appeared to lose altitude and veered eastward over Redondo Beach, where we lost sight of it. And let's look the other direction. That's looking south from our house in front of it, which again is still there. And that's the Palos Verdes Peninsula. In other words, it went down, it was way up here, and it kind of lost altitude and went that way. It didn't go directly over Palos Verdes. It veered eastward and began discernibly to lose. It didn't go way down fast, but it began to lose altitude when it passed from our field of vision. Either our gunners were abysmally inept, Despite all the practice they'd had in recent weeks, which, as I just said, had become almost akin to the sound of the surf, or the thing was, in whatever it was invulnerable to attack. Years later, I read that over 1,400 rounds were fired at the object that evening. The official tally, as I recall, from the Army's after-action report is 1,430. But this figure is probably way too low. I would guess the number was, as Mr. Murillo indicated in his introduction, closer to 1,500 or more rounds were actually fired at it. This is low. Could the enemy have come up with the enemy come up with some secret weapon that deflected flak? The thought was scary to the max. I mean, hey, who's going to win the war, you know? Luckily, that was not correct. The object later appeared over San Pedro and Long Beach before finally disappearing over the ocean somewhere off southern Orange County or northern San Diego County, somewhere off Oceanside, apparently. It disappeared out over the ocean. Several minutes after we lost sight of it, we once again heard the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines, piston-driven aircraft engines. And by that time, the bombardment had almost petered out, and a flight of Army Air Corps interceptors that were probably based at Mines Field, today the site of LAX, Los Angeles International Airport, approached from the south and buzzed off to the southeast, approached from the north, and in the direction of what is now LAX, and buzzed off to the southeast, apparently chasing the object. It seemed pretty obvious they were. There were about three or four, maybe five planes. At that point, it was shortly before 4 a.m. Precisely how long we'd stood there is still hazy in my mind, although I suspect that the whole episode, that is, from the time I followed my mother out to the Strand to the point where the interceptors disappeared from view, lasted about 25 minutes. It could have been 20. The all clear didn't actually sound until 7:30 a.m., although nobody went back to bed that evening, any more than they did this morning, at least I didn't. By 8 a.m. or thereabouts, the early morning edition of the Hearst morning newspaper, the Los Angeles Examiner, which I still have safely tucked away, hit the streets with a war extra, as it called it, with a banner headline that read, "Air battle rages over Los Angeles," and reported that enemy bombs had fallen at several locations and that a, quote, Jap, I don't like to use that epithet, but the era, a Jap plane had been shot down on South Vermont Avenue. And let's take a look at that paper here, if I can get there. Come on. Let's go. All right. Well, here we go. There it is. Okay. Air battle rages. I keep that carefully. I managed to put parts of it together. So that came out at 9 a.m. That was their banner headline. And you can all at the time, the stories about the plane being shot down and L.A. bombed was ridiculous. Seemed ridiculous. Because the paper reported that enemy bombs had fallen at several locations and that the plane had been shot down. At the time, we didn't take them seriously. They seemed pure fantasy, typical Hearst yellow journalism, as no bombs fell anywhere, nor apparently was any plane, Japanese or otherwise, shot down anywhere in Southern California that night, apparently, at least so we believe. And the paper also said, among other things, that the object had been observed flying over Huntington Park, which was totally incorrect. However, in retrospect, the Examiner seems to have been right about one thing. There is now compelling evidence to support the contention that at least one of our planes, almost certainly our planes, did crash, or better, crash land on South Vermont Avenue that evening, somewhere in the vicinity of 180th or perhaps 185th Street. But what precisely had we witnessed? At first, it was widely suspected that it was a high-altitude, carrier-based Japanese observation plane. Or perhaps one of our own military planes was the culprit, although no 1940, as I indicated, no 1942 vintage aircraft was capable of standing stock still in the air. The one thing we did learn after the war was that the Japanese have no record of any of their aircraft flying over the LA basin that fabled evening. Indeed, no Japanese plane ever flew, to the best of our knowledge, over the continental United States during World War II. The Aleutian Islands, yes, American territory, Hawaii, but not the lower 48 in those days. Well, there were only 48 states then anyway. You know what I mean. Some explosive carrying balloons, yes, but no aircraft. The balloons that they sent over the Pacific Northwest, it killed a few people and caused a little damage, nothing that was very peripheral. Anyway, even the presence of our own interceptors, which I both heard and saw, is still steadfastly denied. In fact, the persisting official government position is to this day that there was nothing up there at all that morning, that the whole thing was the result of war nerves, triggered perhaps by the fact that a Japanese submarine had shelled an oil installation north of Santa Barbara less than 48 hours earlier. Initially, as the Los Angeles Times headline of the 26th, the day after, well, this is the story, sorry. This is the story of the plane forced down by gunfire. It's a little hard to read at that distance, but where they start making wild observations about what happened. And here's the LA Times headline of February 26, Army says alarm real. The Army claimed that, according to the Times, that the alarm ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command was real. A short time later, in a classified memo brought to light by a Freedom of Information request, Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall suggested that the alarm was triggered by, and I quote, commercial aircraft operated to spread alarm and slow war production through the blackout and disclose the location of anti-aircraft batteries. Although he had no idea where these commercial aircraft might have come from, the assumption was maybe that Japanese spies were flying them. There were a number of such observations. However, after the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, publicly declared that it had been a, quote, false alarm, the government's position hardened, and what my mother and I had watched slowly glide along the edge of the water was, and still is, officially considered to have been an illusion. Nonetheless, despite the Pentagon party line, I assure you we did indeed see a single elongated oval object that glowed independently of the searchlight beams that illuminated it, and as I just said, made no detectable noise whatsoever. And we did indeed see and hear at least one flight of 4 or 5 U.S. military planes in the sky that were obviously following. See and hear. I heard an earlier flight before the object reached our location. So they were apparently in the air before and after. They weren't up there while, at least in our sector, where they would be shot down by our own cannon. In recent decades, a number of ufologists have suggested that it might have been an alien craft, and if so, it was one of the largest mass UFO sightings in history, as it involved well over 1 million people. Only the sightings over Mexico City in the mid-90s exceeded in terms of the number of percipients. And this is, I'm sure whoops, let me back up. Okay, back up. There we go. Now, here's the charm. There we are. This is a scene, of course, that should be familiar to most people in this room, the Mexico City site in 1997. Millions of people saw these too. But we're right up there. The Battle of L.A. was right up there. To be sure, no one suggested this theory at the time, as it wasn't until later in 1947, after civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold's landmark sighting of 9 flying, quote, flying saucers, as they came to be dubbed, over Mount Rainier in June of that year, of 1947. And let's take a look at Kenneth. Here he is with his boomerang-shaped UFO. This is often seen as the watershed event that triggered the modern UFO era. Anyway, and the notion that UFOs from other planets might be invading our skies became widespread after that time. Although, if the theory that a crash recovery occurred at Cape Girardeau, Missouri in 1941 is correct, it's quite possible that the government already had at least a modicum of knowledge about the phenomenon by March of 1942, that it wasn't talking about, obviously. Several years ago, I joined forces with my good friend Frank Warren. Somebody may, any of you know the UFO Chronicles blog? Is that? If you don't, you should. Who's been investigating this event for many years, although he is, of course, much too young to have observed it personally. With the help of the eminent Navy photo analyst and UFO investigator, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, Frank and I have pretty well determined the craft's path before it appeared in the sky over Hermosa Beach. It was initially observed by several residents of the Pacific Palisades. Well, it was caught, some claim it was caught on radar coming in over Ventura, but in terms of observations, it was initially observed by several residents of the Pacific Palisades, there we go, rising over the Santa Monica Mountains about 2:45 a.m. From there, it seemed to have moved southeast across Santa Monica and West LA in the direction of the Baldwin Hills, which separate Culver City from Inglewood and the flatlands to the south. And let's take a look at the map. So this is what it looks like. It came in from up this way. It was first seen here. It followed roughly this trajectory as best we can reconstruct it. It turned west here, followed along the coast. Here's Hermosa Beach. We saw it right here. And then headed down over San Pedro, Long Beach, and down over Orange County, and if we can extend the map, disappeared out here somewhere over the Pacific, over the ocean. A Los Angeles Times reporter living in the San Gabriel Valley, a dozen miles or so to the east, had been alerted to what was happening. Indeed, he heard the guns from a distance by his colleagues at the paper. He jumped in his car and began driving west as rapidly as he could toward the sound of the guns, arriving at the northern edge of the Baldwin Hills in the vicinity of Jefferson and La Cienega in time to photograph the object, which was caught in the glare of several searchlight beams as it rose over the ridgeline. And I'm sure this is a very famous photograph. I'm just curious, how many of you are familiar? I can't see hands, but are most of you familiar with this picture? Oh, well, you should be. This is a very, very important picture. The picture was published in the Times on February 26, in the same issue that the headline says, the Army says the alarm was real, and is the only picture we have of the craft, at least to date. The white dots surrounding it are almost certainly, get the laser here, though these white dots are almost certainly exploding shells. We think he used a speed graphic and had it set so it was a fairly long exposure. And so he was getting multiple exposures, multiple images of explosions, shell. And notice how close the shells are to it. You would think one of these would have done some damage. There's some argument about whether this one right here is a shell, an explosion, or a little cupola on top of it. There's still argument. There's another one over here. I don't know. It's not impossible that it was a part of the object. But anyway, here are some, here, up here, shell explosions. This was some minutes before we saw it, about 20 minutes before we saw it. And it indicates that by the time it reached that point, as I said, about 10 or 15 minutes or so before my mother saw the thing, that the barrage had begun in earnest. It followed it down the coast. I should add that there's been a debate over exactly where the Times reporter, whose name must remain anonymous at this time, I'm sorry to say, but for a variety of reasons, where he took his famous picture. Some have held that that he caught the object flying over the Palos Verdes hills. But all indications point to a spot on the ridge line just east of where La Cienega cuts through it. And this is a modern picture of where I think it probably happened. The ridge line has changed a little in terms of quite a lot in the last 68 plus years, but nevertheless, this is where I think roughly the point of view where the photographer took it. This is near La Cienega and Jefferson. I've investigated this aspect of the matter pretty thoroughly, and I'm pretty well convinced that I found the right spot, despite the fact that the terrain, as I said, has changed significantly in the last 60-odd years as the area has become more and more developed. Terrenz Sword, another Battle of Los Angeles researcher, maintains that the site was farther east, that is, where La Brea cuts over the Baldwin Hills, and he's put together a composite image to support his contention. And let me show it. This is Sword's image where he's superimposed the Times photograph. It's possible, but my own feeling is that the terrain, as I've looked at it carefully, that it had to be a bit further west. But this is an interesting shot, interesting possibility. In any case, several residents who lived north of the hills, of the Baldwin Hills, in Culver City, saw the object clearly. From their reports, it was round with a slight hump in the middle of the top, that is on its dorsal side, and a similar configuration can be seen on the Mexico City UFO. Oh, wait a minute, let's back up here. Maybe let me see if this is, wait a minute. Where is there it is, the Mexico City UFO. You see the little hump, the little cupola on top. This was observed by a number, we didn't see it for a variety of reasons I'll get to in a moment. We didn't see any real configuration like that, but a number of eyewitnesses did when it was lower up much further north. Moreover, a woman named Katie, who observed it from a window of her home in the Baldwin Hills, recalled that in addition to having a hump or cupola, it was huge, elliptical, and glowing bright orange. Although my mother and I failed to spot, as I said, either the hump or, as I indicated a moment ago, the orange glow. I strongly suspect that what we saw was the object's ventral or belly side, which at that altitude, say between 4,000 and 8,000 feet, was simply glowing white, bright white. From the widths of the beam, the searchlight beam, and let me move forward here again. Let's see. No, let's back up. Wait a minute. Yeah, from the widths of the beams, particularly this beam, this is a key beam. This beam almost certainly came from the Manhattan Beach battery, searchlight battery. Notice the width. Maccabee and others have worked with the light cone, the spread, and it's on the basis of that Bruce thinks the object was at least 100 feet, and maybe as much as 200 or 300 feet in diameter. However, given the width given the distance the beam had to travel from the Manhattan Beach to the Baldwin Hill, this beam, again being the key beam, the others came from different locations, but we can nail this one. Let me use my thing here. We can nail this beam down pretty carefully. My friend Frank Warren has suggests that it may have been considerably larger, perhaps as large as 800 feet in diameter. This may be a bit large, but it's certainly not impossible in terms of what we saw. After crossing the Baldwin Hills, the object appears to have turned westward. And let's go back. I think we're going to go right back to the map, aren't we? Yeah, there's the map. Toward El Segundo. Down here, it goes over the hills, over toward El Segundo, flying over the aircraft plants located there, which makes one wonder if the the object was specifically interested in them. As I'm sure you're well aware, it certainly wouldn't be the first time, wouldn't have been the only time UFOs have been spotted in the vicinity of military bases and production facilities, both military production facilities, both in the U.S. and elsewhere, including the old Soviet Union. In any case, when the object reached the coast, it turned south. When the object, it rose to a higher altitude and slowly followed the edge of the ocean due south to the point where we saw it. And then, as I indicated earlier, it veered over Redondo Beach, over here, and on south, blithely ignoring everything that we were throwing at it, and soon disappeared from view. However, we can tentatively, and I say this, tentatively pick it up over Redondo Beach. Another eyewitness who lived in Redondo and was claims to have been 5 years old at the time, a little younger than I was, has recently come to my attention. He, and I've yet to discover his name, online he goes by the handle The Wanderling, and a little suspicious, but claims that he recalls watching the craft descend as it passed slowly over his family home on Lucia Street in Redondo Beach, which is about a mile back from the ocean. This would have been very shortly, if true, very shortly after we lost sight of it. It was veering over Redondo Beach. This map isn't perfect, the best I could draw. And the man says that his father at first thought the craft was coming in for a landing, perhaps at the nearby Lomita airstrip, and that he and several of his neighbors, his father and several neighbors, jumped into a pickup truck and tried to follow it. It was very low. It was passed very low over his house, he claims. But it soon regained altitude and passed over the Palos Verdes Hills to the south. He also recalls noting that the stern of the craft, as he saw it pass over his house, was rectangular with rounded edges and very thick. You can visit this guy's rather chaotic website by Googling Wanderling and adding Battle of Los Angeles. I take it with a grain of salt, but it is interesting. The one thing that's isomorphic is that as it passed out of our view, it started losing altitude and was indeed heading in the direction of what seemed to be Redondo Beach, eastward, over Redondo. So, anyway, that's one possibility. As I said, it's now pretty certain from eyewitness accounts collected years after the fact that something did not crash on South Vermont Avenue that morning, and that it was almost certainly an American fighter plane forced down either by friendly fire, end quote, or the object itself. Perhaps the plane's primitive avionics were fried by the object's EMF, its field. the same field that protected it against anti-aircraft fire. Anyway, according to one eyewitness account, the downed object was immediately hauled away on a flatbed truck under a tarp, as the military probably didn't want the public to know that it had apparently shot down one of its own planes. That must have been what they believed. That would not have been good for morale. However, the witness in question caught a glimpse of the markings on the fuselage before it was covered up, and he claims that they definitely identified it as one of ours. Moreover, some officers from the 77th Street Division of the LAPD seem to have become involved in the incident, as it was from a 77th Street sergeant that the Examiner claims to have picked up the story of a downed plane. Indeed, someday someone should check the 77th Street police blotter for that long ago morning, assuming it still exists. It's on my to-do list. What happened to the pilot, again, is unknown. Isomorphic with this account is one by a man about my age who was a year ahead of me at Redondo Union High School, a guy named, his name is John Bach. That's not secret. Before moving to the South Bay, John lived as a young kid in Long Beach and claimed he moved to Redondo, I think, or the beach area in 1943 or 4. He saw the object heading northwest over his house at a fairly high altitude, and that it looked like an airplane. He claims that had to be the object. Totally wrong trajectory. What I suspect he saw was not the object, the heading is all wrong, but rather the plane that ended up on Vermont Avenue several minutes before it landed. So we have, again, something isomorphic with that theory. Frank Warren has uncovered an eyewitness account of another possible plane crash that morning, this time in Hollywood somewhere. We don't know exactly where. Again, the downed craft seemed to have been hauled off immediately on a flatbed truck. The witness claims to have seen, quote, Japanese letters on the fuselage, although this is extremely doubtful. The Japanese used Arabic numbers on all of their World War II planes, and he may simply have assumed that it was a Japanese plane and then perceived the rest of what he saw on the basis of that assumption. If a second plane did crash in Hollywood somewhere, it was almost certainly one of ours. What might have led the witness to assume that it was a Japanese plane was the fact that the American aircraft insignia at that time was a star inside a bright red circle, which might have been mistaken for the well-known Japanese meatball or sun disk, which is on the wings and the fuselage of all Japanese planes in World War II. It wasn't until the summer of 1942 that we began marking our planes with a bar through the star, the white star, so they wouldn't be misidentified as enemy aircraft, and that has persisted to this day. It's been recently suggested on the basis of what, in my opinion, is some pretty shaky evidence, but I offer it for what it's worth, that the object itself crashed in the ocean off San Diego County and was recovered by Navy divers. One informant even claims to know the name of the ship that picked it up, and that some, quote, Nordic bodies were discovered in the wreckage, although I take this one with a huge grain of salt, big enough to cover Studio City. Yet another recent assertion, equally if not even more shaky, is that it landed more or less intact on San Clemente Island, in those days, and until fairly recently, a Navy bombing range, and was immediately commandeered either by the Navy or the Marine Corps, presumably along with its occupants, dead or alive. If there's any validity to either of these theories, it would reinforce the possibility that the military, or at least the Navy, already had a fair amount of solid UFO evidence in hand at the time of the Roswell crash in 1947, in addition to any that might have been gathered prior to 1942. There were only a handful of civilian casualties. According to the Times, 5 people died from heart attacks and automobile accidents, and there were, as I've indicated, a few injuries from falling shrapnel. There was also some minor property damage, mostly from shrapnel. The same Long Beach eyewitness, John Bach, who may have seen the plane that later landed on South Vermont, also says he saw a piece of shrapnel crash through his neighbor's garage roof. Yes, there were a great many jangled nerves that morning, but the overall impact of the event was slight compared to other disasters, earthquakes, fires, floods, etc., this region has experienced over the years. Although the official explanation of this episode has been that it really didn't exist, a great many unofficial ones have been advanced over the years, including an errant barrage balloon, that had slipped its tether over one of the El Segundo aircraft plants, a lost Army weather balloon, shades of Roswell, or an off-course and perhaps intoxicated private pilot, perhaps in a vintage Piper Cub. Here we go. Although civilian aircraft had been firmly banned from the skies over Southern California since the outbreak of the war. It's even been suggested that the whole thing was caused by a flock of remarkably flak-resistant seabirds. Here we go. Well, let's get the seabirds in here. Come on. There they are. Yeah, all right. A flock of remarkably, I call in my slide prompt is high-flying pelicans. But none of these explanations comes anywhere close to being satisfactory. As we've seen from most reports as well as the Times photograph, the object appears to have been a huge glowing saucer-shaped object with a distinct protuberance on its dorsal side, on its top. To be sure, unlike the witnesses who observed it at a much lower level in Culver City and the Baldwin Hills, my mother and I only saw a bright shimmering lozenge caught in the glare of the searchlights. And the previously mentioned eyewitness in Redondo Beach remembers it as being rectangular, at least in its stern portion, which he apparently observed after it crossed over his house. Nevertheless, despite his atypical recollection, after all, he was only 5 years old at the time, a young kid as compared to a boy of 8, and the aforementioned probability that what we saw was the object's ventral or belly, lower ventral side, the majority of the descriptions that Frank Warren and I have collected, as well as the object caught in the Times reporter's photograph, jibe closely with literally tens of thousands of eyewitness accounts of UFOs, of disc-shaped objects, not triangles. They seem to come later, but that's another story. In this country and elsewhere that have come to light in the course of the last 7 decades. That is a large, glowing, disc-shaped object between 100 to 300 feet, maybe as high as 800 feet in diameter, with a small cupola or dome on its dorsal side, such as we saw in the the slide of Mexico City. And let's go look at that. Here it is again. Here's the shape. My feeling is that the object caught in the Times photograph is basically similar to this. And here is a blow-up of the Times photograph. And here is again another example of the cupola. It was found in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Let's see, come on. I'm trying to use this as a laser beam. Here we go. I told you I was kind of punchy. Here's the cupola, and again, if you look, here's that controversial little protuberance here. Is this part of the craft itself, or is it an exploding shell? It's an open question, but clearly others saw this cupola. Yes, there are a host of sizes and configurations, including triangles, globes, and the boomerang-shaped objects that Arnold reported in 47, and we saw earlier the woman in Pasadena. I'd love to know where she saw that. Somebody did. Do you know exactly where she saw it? Where is Mr. Murillo? Is he? Do you know, can you tell me roughly where in Pasadena she saw the triangle?
She's close to JPL.
Close to JPL, okay. Because I live in the west edge, and I'd love to have seen it. I'm a Pasadenan as well. But nevertheless, the triangles were not around at this point. But over the decades, this is by far the most frequently reported UFO, at least as I understand it, configuration. And the fact that such an object appeared over in the Southern California skies in that morning, that morning in 1942, is, I think, extremely significant. However, the aspect of the episode that clinches the extraterrestrial theory, at least as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that the object itself was able to resist the impact of over 1,400 rounds of high-explosive anti-aircraft shells. No contemporary aircraft, let alone any World War II vintage planes, could have withstood that barrage, especially flying at such a slow speed and even hovering now and then, as it seems to have done over our house. But as I've indicated, I strongly suspect that it was surrounded by an electromagnetic field of some sort that warded off the ack-ack and may have forced at least one of our interceptors to crash land. It's also possible, of course, that the object, as I said, had in fact been wounded by a lucky hit from the intense anti-aircraft fire, and after nearly crashing into Redondo Beach, if the Wanderling is correct, eventually lost control way down off Orange. It got itself together and then finally lost control and crashed into the sea. But this is pure speculation. To be sure, in the post-war era, after we'd obtained the technology to build sophisticated air-to-air rockets from captured German scientists, it was another story. At that point, as Frank Fascino Jr. has recently pointed out in his well-researched book, Shoot Them Down, which I published in 2007, which I heartily recommend, we did probably have the capability to shoot down UFOs at least occasionally, which may in part explain the spate of UFO crashes, including perhaps even the ones at Roswell and Aztec in the late 1940s and early 1950s, but not in 1942. That the whole business has been covered up by the government for the past 68 years seems almost certain. I needn't tell this audience that most ufologists are convinced that a similar cover-up has been in place regarding Roswell, the Roswell crash since '47, to say nothing of what's been going on in Area 51, and as I said, perhaps they, that is, the government, already had a model based on their response to the February 1942 incident that was brought to bear in hushing up later episodes. Or perhaps they've simply been in denial for the past 7 decades. Extremely doubtful, but remotely possible. Maybe someday the truth about the Battle of Los Angeles will finally come out, along with the truth about so many other anomalous phenomena that so many people all over the world and have seen and continue to see in the sky, both before and after 1942, before as well. Then again, it may just prove to have been a flak resistance barrage balloon that our gunners simply couldn't bring down. But I wouldn't bet the family farm on that possibility. In sum, in light of and let's take a look at go through this in a slide. In light of the object's purposeful, get my gizmo working here. In light of the object's purposeful, intelligently controlled flight pattern, its invulnerability to an intense anti-aircraft barrage, its size, possibly 800 feet in diameter, although I think it was probably smaller, its bright white and in some accounts orange glow, which was evident even within the searchlight beams, its configuration, an oval disc with a protuberance or cupola on the dorsal side, its apparent EMF impact on at least one of our interceptors, and the absence of any post-war Japanese records of one of their planes being over Los Angeles that night, I submit that the most efficient explanation for the object that triggered the Battle of Los Angeles in the early morning hours of February 25th, 1942, is that it was a genuine, honest-to-God extraterrestrial craft. I'm convinced that what I witnessed that night when I was 8 years old in front of 2500 Strand in Hermosa Beach was a classic UFO episode, one that must be ranked among the most important episodes in the history of this remarkable phenomenon, if only because it was witnessed by more than 1 million people across Southern California, all of whom prayed successfully, as it turned out, that it was not the harbinger of a Japanese attack. Unfortunately, the great majority of those who actually saw the object have passed on to their rewards, and I'm beginning to see mine heading up here in the foreseeable future, unfortunately. However, Frank Warren and I are hot on the trail of several more key eyewitnesses, or perhaps their progeny. Indeed, I met one a couple of weeks ago at the Fort MacArthur Museum, which displays a number of artifacts associated with the Battle of Los Angeles, including shrapnel and old newspaper articles like the ones I showed you. They're framed and on the wall. If you have never been to the museum, it's worth a trip. It's in an old former ammunition bunker underneath the great coast defense guns. And that's right. Yep.
Right towards the end of Gaffney Street as you're going towards the ocean.
That's correct. You got it. That's where to find it. And it's also the site of an annual party on February 25th commemorating the event. Here's a poster from, wait a minute, let's go forward. Come on. Here it is. There we go. This is the 2006. They held this year's commemoration not on the 25th, but on the 20th, because it was a Saturday. But this was the 2006 party. They have quite a party. They have bands. They sort of get retro and do the 40s, and you dance to swing music and that kind of thing. You know, it's kind of, apparently, I've never been to one of the parties, and I'm going to have to go next year, I promise. Why I was there was that I was being interviewed by a History Channel crew for a forthcoming episode of its Ancient Alien series, some of you may have seen. The guy, now I remember, I met a guy here. The guy, the eyewitness they were interviewing, along with yours truly, was a guy whose name was Albert, claimed to have seen the object from Beverly Hills at age 13, a little older than I am, as it flew over the Baldwin Hills, surrounded by explosions and searchlight beams, some 20 miles south of his vantage point. What makes Albert's account unique and somewhat questionable, in my opinion, despite his coherence — he was a very coherent wit, I listened to the interview as they filmed it — is that he also claims to have seen American fighter planes above it, a flight of interceptors above it. No one else has reported anything similar, and Katie in the Baldwin Hills made no mention of any conventional aircraft. Still, it's not impossible and needs to be thoroughly checked out. Moreover, Frank Warren is convinced that there are more photographs out there somewhere, and he has several promising leads. Indeed, we may even be able to find the rest of the photos the Times reporter shot that morning. Thus, I assure you that the last word on the Battle of Los Angeles has yet to be uttered or written. There's definitely more to come, so please stay tuned. Thank you. Before I take some questions, I'd like to add one little coda here. I should mention that this talk is in fair measure an expanded and updated version of a chapter in my recent memoir, 2500 Strand, Growing Up in Hermosa Beach, California during World War II, which discusses the flying French horn I mentioned at the outset, and a number of other things. The book was published by the Red Pill Press in 2008, and like my novel, Phase 2, my UFO-themed novel, is on Amazon. I urge you to check both of them out. Unfortunately, the copies I'd hoped to have available here this evening, for your pleasure, didn't arrive by the time I left home this afternoon, or this evening. So here, for the final slide, are pictures. Here, I'm shamelessly plugging my book, but what the hell. Let's go here. Let me get this aimed right, I think. Yeah, here are the covers, the two covers. This is the memoir, and this is Phase 2. So the cover, I think it's an intriguing cover, and some people might want to read. And that's the address of, the best I can do is Red Pill's website, and you can find both of these on Amazon. That's my...
All right, let's give Scott a hand, guys.